Hitchhikers of Reddit, what's your craziest story? Story 1. While hitchhiking in Germany, I got in the car of a guy who drove with his left foot out the window while blazing down the Autobahn. He had a million different kinds of food and drink in his car that he would occasionally offer me, and then he'd fish around for things while he was driving like a madman. Very funny guy though, but strange individual. Yeah, for those of you who don't know, the recommended speed on the Autobahn is 130 kilometers per hour, 81 miles per hour, and yes, that's the speed recommended by the government. You gotta appreciate a man with confidence behind the wheel though. Story 2. Some friends and I were driving to Atlantic City from Philadelphia when our car broke down. So the two of us decided to hitchhike. We got picked up by this trucker, nice enough guy, but he mistook us for lot lizards when we got to the city and he tried to convince us to spend the night with him. Story 3. In Japan, I met some really interesting folk. The first guy I met was some super cool old dude who took me to a cafe. We drank coffee and ate cake together. Man, I want to be that chill. Like the kind of person who's just so comfortable with everything around them that you can't help but feel comfortable too. That's how this guy was. Next guy I met was a middle-aged businessman who needed an outfit for a work event. So he picked me up and we went to Uniqlo together, and I helped him pick out said outfit. I also got a ride from a young Japanese sales guy. It was a really pleasant trip to Nagano at 4 a.m. We talked about politics, life, healthcare, and watched the sunrise over snow-filled valleys. Back when it was safe to do so, this was probably my favorite way to enjoy different countries I'd visit. Story 4. Young guy from Liverpool who owned 2 falcons. I couldn't understand his accent at all, but he was so friendly. He stopped for me after I'd been waiting outside Newcastle for around 90 minutes, and I was ready to give up. He talked about how proud he was that he had a real job that wasn't delivering drugs. He talked about his falcons and his mates. Another time, there was a middle-aged couple who wanted to move to Spain. He was Glaswegian and hadn't traveled till he was around 28. And she was English and constantly on the move. He told a beautiful story about how he knew she was the one when they first met, but they were both with different people at the time. They actually ended up moving to Spain a year later, I think. I also met a salmon farm inspector who was going across Scotland, who I learned all about the salmon farming process from. It was surprisingly interesting stuff. Yeah, if you've never looked it up, actually, check out the Alaskan salmon farms. They give the salmon a place to swim upstream and create a whole ecosystem for them to do what they do in nature, but just in a contained environment. It's actually really cool and pretty ingenious. Story 5. This was some years ago when hitchhiking in New Zealand, I was picked up near Amaru. I didn't realize until I got in the car that they were all wearing gang colors. In New Zealand, it's well known that gang prospects will pick up and murder hitchhikers to prove themselves. I thought I was done for until one reached into his pack, grabbed me a beer, and started chatting with me. He was the nicest dude ever, and the driver kept turning around and asking me if I had a fresh drink or a smoke. We ended up taking psychedelics together, getting drunk, and when we arrived at my destination, they bought me a pack of cigs and paid the cover for my entrance to a gig I was going to. Absolute legends. I love that. That could have turned out horribly for this hitchhiker, but they turned out just to be a bunch of really stand-up guys. Stories like that are always good to hear. Story 6. I was in Croatia. One of my first times ever hitchhiking, actually. I needed to go from Dubrovnik to Split. For those who know, it's not a very big distance, a few hundred kilometers, and I had a train to catch in Split, but thought I had a lot of time ahead of me because I didn't want to rush. Hitchhiking and being in a hurry don't go well together. So I end up on the middle of a road. The last person had left me at a bus stop, so cars had room to pull over and pick me up. I'd been waiting for around 45 minutes and started worrying a bit about the train I had to catch, as I still had around 150 kilometers to cover. At some point I see this BMW pass by, and I think to myself, damn, that would have been cool to get a ride in, but whatever. The guy goes for like 50 meters past me, then turns around and pulls over by me. The guy asks where I'm going. I tell him, and he says, no problem, hop in. The dude happened to be a guy that had hitchhiked a couple years before me and knew the struggle it could be, so he decided to give me a ride. But it gets better. At some point, he asks if I'm hungry, to which I say, yeah, so he asks me if I like kebabs. Of course I like kebabs. So the guy pulls his phone out, calls someone on speed dial, and starts speaking Croatian. 2 minutes in, he asks me, salad, tomato, onions? Yeah. You want sauce? Yeah, absolutely. Mayonnaise, please, as well. The guy continues on the phone for about 2 minutes, then shows me a video feed on his phone and goes, I own a kebab place. This is the video feed live from my shop, and that guy you see there, he's making your kebab right now. I was blown away. The guy then drives me to his shop, which he actually had to restock some lettuce and tomatoes, so he didn't go there just for me. And after he drops off the produce, he comes out from the back, gives me my kebab, a beer, and drives me straight to the train station. The guy also has a nightclub over there. We stayed in touch, and he said to come by if I'm ever in the neighborhood. Since then, I've hitchhiked for thousands of kilometers across Europe, Russia, Taiwan, and whenever it takes a while before someone picks me up, that story of the guy in the BMW always brings a smile to my face. Hitchhiking can be a really cool experience, and I'm probably going to hold on to that memory for a very long time. Story 7. Girlfriend and I got picked up in Florida by a truck driver. He seemed like a milk and cookies kind of guy. We stop at the truck stop, and he grabs a shower and some food, offers my girl a chance to make some money by cleaning the inside of his rig while he's away, and so she gets to work while I stay close by and take our dog for a quick potty walk. But when I look back, something just didn't seem right. Only a minute went by, but I run to the truck and rip the door open to find the driver had snuck back in and was heavily pressuring her to make a little more money. Our dog was about ready to jump this guy, and I yanked my girlfriend out while pushing the psycho back and keeping our dog at the ready in case he pulled out a gun or something. Thank God he didn't. Another don't judge a book by its cover lesson. Well, I was kind of hoping for a Florida man scenario out of that one. Like the driver went out and robbed a bakery, then started yelling at them, "Drive!" as he hopped in through the truck's window. But this was just kind of a standard essay situation. It's fucked up, absolutely, but just not in the way you'd think a story starting with, "We were picked up by a Florida truck driver" would be. Glad these two are okay though. Story 8. I was the one picking up the hitchhiker actually, so there's a guy with his thumb out just before an on-ramp onto the motorway, and I pick him up, seems like a nice tourist, and while we chat, he changes his tone a little bit and tells me that he's been in the Chinese army for the last, I think, 6 years, and has just come back from a tour of somewhere. So me, being an idiot, asked if he saw much action, and he said not that much, but then I asked if he'd ever killed someone while in battle. I don't know what I was thinking, but his reply was to turn to me and say in a deadpan voice, "Not yet." So I quickly told him that I lived in the area, and so couldn't take him any further, and dropped him off. Off he went, while I spent the next few days checking news sites for any hitchhiker murders. Story 9. In Japan, people will pull over and just ask what you're doing. I was walking up the Noto Peninsula with a friend of mine, and we got a lift from a fellow who was on his way to see his family. He drove us about 100 kilometers, stopping along the way at a bunch of places that we never would have found on our own. At some point, we asked where his family lived, and figured out that we'd actually passed by his town hours ago, and that he was just enjoying the trip too. Now that right there, that's just fucking wholesome. I love that. Story 10. Was picked up by an elderly Russian couple in an F-150 after my radiator blew on the highway, with no phone service for miles in either direction. I was going to town a few hours away from where I lived to pick up some parts to repair the truck before it blew. But these two that picked me up were the absolute sweetest people. They had extremely thick accents and were touring through the state for their first time to see the sights. It was in southern Utah. I was super stressed, 18 years old, and trying to figure out what to do next. The people I worked with were waiting on me to text that I'd made it, and it was getting dark. They took me to the most gorgeous overlook of the Boulder Mountains, filled my cup of coffee with their thermos, and waited with me for over an hour to make sure that I had a ride and that I was safe, as there was a recent rash of mountain lion attacks in the area. I have no idea what I would have done if they hadn't stopped for me. Real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, don't forget to like and subscribe. It does an absolute ton to help me out, and I would really appreciate it. Now back to it. Story 11. I got picked up by a priest in New Mexico. He turned up some motivational tapes and told me to grab the coffee can in the far back. He had some pre-rolls in there, and we each smoked our own for the next 2 hours on this drive. Another time, I was picked up in Summit County, Colorado, and had a great ride to Denver. Driver offered to take us to his house with wife and kids and feed us some venison stir-fry. He was a hunter. We took him up on his offer, and pretty much as soon as he walked through the door, he started gulping down some black velvet whiskey and turned into an absolute madman. Girlfriend and I ran out the front door and walked the rest of the way to the I-70. Story 12. I got picked up by a young group from Illinois when I was hiking through Arizona. We were camping out in the Mojave Desert when suddenly one of their dads came running and screaming out of absolutely nowhere. He was pissed. Apparently they left him back in Missouri when he jumped off a cliff, so they could go to the hospital to get him painkillers, and they just left him there. On the same ride, a guy in the back seat pulled out a needle and jammed it straight into his chest and injected straight adrenaline. They seemed really nice, but Jesus. So we roll on, and they dropped me off at a hog farm in Lasantville where I proceeded to have an absolute blast with my girlfriend. Yeah, I'm gonna call BS on that Mojave Desert camping story. They ditched the guy to get painkillers after a bad fall instead of helping him back up, and then the guy tracks them down from Missouri to the middle of the Mojave Desert. Yeah, no, seems pretty unlikely. Story 13. I got picked up by a truck driver on my way to Ohio. I fell asleep, which is a big no-no when hitchhiking, and when he woke me up, we were way off the highway in some very private country setting. He then proceeded to yell at me for falling asleep because God knows what he could have done to me if he were a freak. This was my first hitch ever, so this taught me a really good lesson. He continued back to the highway and drove me all the way to my destination. I'm very glad that he was the first person I ever rode with. Story 14. A dustbin lorry on the Amalfi Coast. I needed to get up the mountains to a lemon orchard I was told I could camp in. It was sweltering hot, and I was pretty sure I'd pass out soon. This dustbin lorry stopped for me. A guy handed me an apple and a knife as he could see I was struggling, and told me to hop into the back. I gave them a hand with the bins all the way up. Those roads are so thin and treacherous, one slip and you're gone. So I hung on for dear life. That was my very short-lived career working for apples as a dustbin man. Story 15. I was picked up in Utah by a man who had some obvious mental handicap. He reminded me a lot of Jason Winters from Mork and Mindy. Super nice, but the van was filled with fast food wrappers. He offered to take us back to his place for food and to relax for a bit before he gets us back to a better hitchhiking on-ramp. We get to his house, which is like some underground shipping container thing, and are greeted at the door by a woman who I can only describe as looking like a dog with mange. She had scabs and large patches of missing hair. My friends and I, at this point, were questioning our decision-making, but we go in and sit down. They actually fed us some great food, and after dinner, this three-legged dog came out into the family room along with another guy who was also suffering from some serious physical handicaps and had one of those claw arms. After dinner, our driver rolled a bunch of doobies, and we all kicked back and relaxed with full stomachs. He proceeded to grab his guitar and cracks out his best version of Mr. Sandman Bring Me a Dream. This guy was seriously talented. He rolls us a few more hog legs for the road, and then we load up and he drives to a nearby on-ramp in a spot that he says will get us a really quick ride. I learned the best lesson that day. Never judge a book by its cover. Great man whom I consider somewhat of an angel. Story 16. I hitchhiked with a couple of Roma. There was no back seat, so I had to cross my legs in order to sit, and a little kid, maybe 5 years old or so, stood right next to me. It was a fun thing to see how they were so culturally different. He even offered me some chips that he was eating. They were good people. Another time, while walking back from a football game, I hitchhiked with some gang members. How would I know they were gang members? Well, because one of them told a story where he was putting a gun in somebody else's mouth because the guy hadn't paid his boss. And this fella began laughing as he talked about the way that person started to cry. Thankfully, it was a short trip, and I was with friends at the time, so it wasn't that scary as it might sound like, and they were surprisingly nice to us. They each gave us one of those mini pop cans for the ride. Story 17. I hitched from Coos Bay, Oregon to Humboldt County, California with a friend. We ended up getting picked up by an escort, and may have partaken in smoking and drinking with her for a few minutes parked in the woods. She mentioned how smoking makes her a little frisky, and my friend and I just kinda sat there quiet. We drank some more beer, and then, thankfully, drove off again. I'm not sure what was in her mind, but nothing was mentioned from there on out. Hey, maybe instead of getting picked up, she was doing the picking up, keeping her business mobile. Kind of like a food truck, but for sex. Story 18. I remember hitchhiking a while back in Paris, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. It was a lengthy trip, and at one point I got picked up by some guys in a battered Toyota. Instantly I knew they were in some sort of gang or something, simply by the clothing they were all wearing, and I could tell that they were from some country in Asia. It seemed like they were from Korea, and I was pretty reluctant to even climb in the car, but they seemed friendly enough, so I said screw it and got in. Biggest mistake of my life. They would constantly talk in Korean or whatever while staring at me, and it had to be the most uncomfortable situation ever. They'd also sniff me and stare at my jeans, which contained my phone and wallet, as well as my passport and a lot of other stuff. Eventually, we stopped at a gas station to top up, and they all climbed out at the same time and went into the shop. I turned to look behind me as I was sat in the back and noticed a bulging duffel bag, which was half open and had what seemed to be a loaded gun in it. It looked like a rifle, and not for hunting. There were also small packets of white powder, all evenly distributed, and a decent amount of cash just lying in the back. At least a couple hundred from what I could see. I decided at that gas station that it was probably time to leave, so I opened the door and sprinted as fast as I could across the road to the bus stop, just out of sight. No idea what would have happened if I'd stayed in that car with them, but God, am I glad that I got the fuck out of there. That's all for today. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and remember that despite these stories being overall pretty good experiences, hitchhiking does come with some serious risks that you shouldn't ignore, and is often illegal in certain areas, so do your due diligence, and make sure you're safe out there if you decide that hitchhiking is something you want to do. And with that said, I'm ReddList, I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and I will see you next time.